Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Megan Crotto. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Excited to have some folks in the room and many joining us online today. So thank you for spending some time with us. As you may know, AFP is a network of over 200 organizations. We just crossed that 200 threshold. We're very excited about it. And our members, like Search for Common Ground, are working in over 181 countries to prevent and reduce violent conflict and build sustainable peace. We are thrilled today to be here with our colleagues from Search to host a conversation on a new book, Foreign Aid and Its Unintended Consequences, by Professor Dirk-Jan Koch. Excellent. Okay, my Dutch ancestors are proud of me. Who is a Chief Science Officer with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also a Special Professor of International Trade and Development Cooperation at Radboud University. This discussion comes at a really interesting time where I think we're thinking about the unintended consequences of foreign aid as we reflect on the situation currently unfolding Israel and Palestine and other places around the world. We know that conflict occurs within a complex system made of so many factors and actors that can both drive violence and promote peace. So having a key understanding of how aid functions and how we as actors in that space interact with the conflict drivers and fragility is very essential for us as peace builders to think through how to make sure our work is conflict sensitive and integrated into other sectors in a way that doesn't produce unintended consequences. So I'm not here to steal the show. This is all about you and your talk. So I'm very excited to turn it over to Shamil Idris, CEO of Search for Common Ground. As I mentioned, a leading AFP member and the largest dedicated peace-building organization in the world.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you to everybody who's here. It looks like we got almost 60 participants online and many more in the room here. It is always a pleasure to do anything in partnership with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. So thank you for hosting this. Dirk-Jan Koch is a friend, a colleague, sort of a boss in some ways, being on the board of Search for Common Ground Brussels. But I have to say before I introduce him, just for people who haven't actually seen the book yet or picked up the book, I would say this whether Dirk was next to me or not, or whether he was at all affiliated with Search or not. I found it astonishingly accessible for a book that had so much rich insight. So, you know, each chapter has a cartoon. The cartoons are hilarious, thought-provoking, touching, you know, amazing. Each has insights just bullet pointed that are taken from theory, but then concrete examples taken from real world examples for each the point that each chapter is making. And it was interesting because Dirk, you cover 3 fields. You're an academic, you're a special professor of international development and cooperation. Even though you call development studies in the book the most preposterous field in academia, I think. You are Chief Science Officer at the Foreign Ministry of Denmark, so, of the Netherlands, and so you have the policymaker's lens, and then you've been a practitioner as well. And those three, so if you come out of any of those spaces, practitioner, policymaker, academic, evaluator, the book's really rich. It's exceptional. So we're thrilled to have you here, bringing all that insight. Last thing that I would share is I also got a kick out of the book is also very vulnerable and open about your own lessons learned, self-critical. And you even note, I think it's in the acknowledgements that at some point a minister, fellow minister, someone asked the question, isn't there something better our chief science officer could be doing than the 7 years of research that you did to produce this? Glad that you weathered that storm. So please, let me turn it over to you, and we look forward to your comments, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion.
Thanks, Shamal. Indeed, and you don't always make yourself very popular. Indeed, studying and writing a book on side effects. Even though I make the case that there's a lot of positive side effects as well, but people tend to remember the negative side effects that I mentioned of their organization. But and I see that there are so many people online, also some people from that I've known for a long time. I saw Lena and Vanessa and others. So thank you very much. I expect quite some tough questions for you. But before I get those questions, I will abuse the time to share some of the research that I've been doing. So maybe we can pull up the presentation, and so we're going to focus on the book. And actually, my interest in this started in the DRC when I was teaching there at the university, and I asked one of my students at the end of a 10 course program on international development, and do you think that international development helps or hinders the DRC? And the student said, yeah, I think it helps, Professor. And I asked, so why do you think it helps? She says, well, my cousin has been working for this international NGO, Caritas, for the last 10 years, and he has been paying my tuition fees in high school, my tuition fees at university, and now I have already an internship at the bank thanks to these studies, and I'll get a job there. And without the salary and the support I got from my cousin, I would have never been able to do this. So yes, international development definitely works. And that triggered for me the interest in, like, okay, that was not in the course I was teaching you. It was not in the theory of change of your organization that you would sustain the school fees of the extended families, but it was for them the most tangible result actually of the work. So ever since that experience, I thought, okay, let's focus more on all those things which are outside of all these predetermined events we have. So you can move on 2 slides because there's a typo in the next slide. So let's move to the next one. Yeah, good. And it was too fast, so you didn't see it. So why should we focus more on the unintended effects? So I think there's 3 main reasons. And one is that it can really stop preventable damage to human lives. We've all said, oh, do no harm. But I feel that actually often we didn't really take that seriously. We see that, for instance, with the sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeeping missions or aid workers, that for too long time we didn't really have a strong policy on that. And now, and then it can continue what we have seen in Haiti, and suddenly now we're taking it more seriously. I do think it really helps us to see better the dilemmas and discuss the dilemmas also in the peace building sector, and you can really put an emergency brake when we need it. Of course, we work a lot with security sector reform, and I think it's important that we do that also in countries with militaries that are substandard, to say the least. But you should be aware that at the same time you do then legitimize those actors, and you pay their transport fees, or you pay their sitting fees. So I think it's important to take that into consideration to see whether it's not worthwhile to engage in these efforts. And the last one, I think it's very important and it's very practical. You know, we have all these discussions about value for money also in peace building, and there's this push to do it for 7% if you get EU funding, or to push your NICRA down if you do it with. I don't know what you're talking about. But I do think that maybe that it's penny wise but pound foolish, right? Because then you start cutting down on checks and balances and due diligence, and then you get all these bigger problems. I'm glad that in our office in the EU we've now for the first time turned down a contract to work for 7% in Somalia, and we just said we cannot do it. We cannot do proper work in Somalia for 7%. And what you see happening is that then another agency, okay, more rookie agency, is taking the contract for the 7% overhead and is not doing all the quality controls that search would be doing. So I think to really focus more on the side effects, enables a more honest discussion actually on the true costs. Okay, so
Just quickly, we had a question in the chat. Could you explain NICRA, the acronym NICRA for the audience? I know DC, lots of acronyms.
I know you didn't have this. You added this. No, go ahead.
what does it stand for? It's like the Okay, so already the first question I blank. I'm so sorry, guys. So, but this is the money you get from the USA government for all the indirect costs you have. And there's this push to bring it down, but I say, well, I mean, those costs are there often for a reason, right? Because you want to do proper checks and balances, for instance. Okay. Okay, I see other people already. Oh, Nick Haley already responding. Thank you. Thank you. The wisdom of the crowd. Yeah, good.
She's from the UK.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we cannot deal with all the 10 side effects, but so I'll let you vote on which ones you really want to discuss. I'll go through them, 10 of them very rapidly, means that you really need to pay attention because you will need to vote afterwards, okay? And then we're going to look at the solutions. If you are interested at the same time, you can just, if you're online and you want to check something, the book is for free, so you can just download it, a copy. And in the book, I start with the 5 myths, and I want to start with those myths as well here. And so when I started the research, and it started 7 years ago, it took a while, I thought that they couldn't be really anticipated. I thought they would be some kind of surprises, but actually, but I realized that many of the side effects you can anticipate. And for instance, in a lot of the conflict sensitivity work, we now already provide examples of things that can go wrong. For instance, in the hiring practices, if you don't hire any from the local community, don't hire anybody, then there will be contestation and sometimes even violent riots in front of your agency if you're not doing that. So now we know that. And also good news is that we can, if you know it, you can often do something about it. So the good news is that when we did a big analysis of all the evaluations of the Dutch government, we did see that there's actually a drop in conflicts induced by aid over time. All the conflict sensitivity work seems to be paying off. So that's good news, actually. And it shows that if you take side effects seriously, you can do something about it. I thought I was quite naive that often the side effects would be downplayed, but we found actually that there's also a lot of actors who like to exaggerate the side effects, negative side effects, because they are against foreign aid or against international solidarity. And the slightest mistake, they kind of blow out of proportions and to say, you see those do-gooders, they only make matters worse, actually. And the good news is also that we found that a lot of the side effects are actually positive. And for instance, what we saw in the DRC, just one example is that we were providing the content to those radio stations, the CDs, but they didn't only stay with those partner radio stations. I mean, they were copying it and other stations were also using it, the content. So if you then only measure your results with your partner radio stations, you miss out a lot of the ripple effects you have. And interestingly, the 0.5, I think I have learned that from Gabriel, from Adrian's research, because Adrian, you have been right with me on this project from the start, actually, is that unintended effects are not really an objective phenomenon, which makes life a bit more complicated. But what is an unintended effect for us often is not an unintended effect for the others. And I think that was the research, what we did with search, which showed that some things were considered by Western donors as unintended. For instance, the sitting fees that you have to pay for military personnel to participate in your training program. But for those military personnel, this was not an unintended effect. The reason that they participated in the training often was the transport cost that they would get. So for them, it was very much an intended effect. This didn't make the research much more simple, but it did make it much more interesting, I have to say. Okay. Are you ready for the top 10 of unintended effects? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm also counting on you to help me. So we'll start with number 1. You can go to the next one, and that's the backlash effect. And so this one is, we see, for instance, in the Sahel these days, that we think that we are doing great stuff, the international community, and then suddenly we're being chased away from a country. Or, for instance, the Ebola treatment centers are a great example. Foreign donors coming in thinking we're supporting you in fighting the biggest health crisis in your country, and then suddenly those centers are being burned down. So what's happening here? Apparently there's a lot of an undercurrent in society that we, or the evaluators, the researchers, we're often not aware of. And then suddenly it erupts because they see those people in big white clothing coming, and they think that they are actually bringing the Ebola instead of reducing the Ebola. And for them it's some kind of, it smells of the colonialist practices where they would come in, those doctors, and test medication without proper licenses. So I understand where it's coming from, but we often overlook it. Second one, so you can vote for this one if you want to hear more about it. The second one are the conflict effects, and unfortunately see a big rise in abductions of aid workers, international, but also especially national aid workers. And what you see is that these ransom payments are really cashing a lot of the rebel regimes and enabling them to continue with their rebellion activities. The third one are the migration and resettlement effects. I think also some of your organizations are now taking money which fall under the migration, reducing irregular migration funding streams. And I'm not opposing that at all, but I do see that some of the ideas don't seem to really hold. So the idea is that if we provide additional education opportunities and skills to people living in migration camps, that in refugee camps, that they won't migrate. But what we see that there is often an increase in migration after people have participated in those training programs, because they are like, yeah, okay, now I have additional skills, and why not give it a shot and go to Europe with it? So if you would like to hear more from that, about that, please vote for this one. Then the next one is the price effects. This morning I was presenting at the World Bank and they all wanted to talk about this. I'm not sure if the Peacebuilders will vote for this one, but it's about how localized inflation can be induced by cash transfers. I'm not going too much into detail, but I think you understand the gist of it. So we can move to the next one, the marginalization effects. This example is about the teenagers from the US or from Europe who want to do good, and in their gap year they go and work in an orphanage to help orphans. But yeah, research shows that often those orphans aren't real orphans, and they are just kids from disenfranchised families who are actually put in those orphanages to make sure that the Western kids feel good about themselves. And so then the support only marginalizes those kids additionally. The good news is that if you do now there's this research is on the table, and there's these campaigns to warn people to not do this actually. So to me, it's also a positive example. Okay, then the behavioral effects. The picture is, the cartoon is a bit rude, but it's really the reality. So I think it's better to show what can happen. In the microfinance programs, you see that the support for women can sometimes help them economically, but this emancipation process sometimes comes at the price, in this case, increased domestic violence. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do microfinance programs, but see if you can design it in such a way that this backlash, individual level backlash effect, is not as strong. Okay? The governance effects, I think that, no, I'm not going to say that it might be interesting for you. You have to make up your mind yourself. But this is what you see, is that the social contract in countries is actually affected by foreign aid flows coming in. It sometimes distorts the priorities of the governments and tilts them towards what the donor is interested in, as opposed to what the population is interested in. While the population might be interested in jobs, the foreign donor might say, why don't you build a migration management center? And then the government does this because it gets cash for that, but then they get this disconnect between the expectations from the population and what the government provides, only increases. The negative spillover effects, I think you have seen that maybe in practice, that donors are often not behaving in a rational way. They have their pet projects, their themes that they really want to focus on. And then all the attention of the local government officials or nurses or doctors go into this specific disease, for instance. And then less sexy diseases are overlooked, such as the sleeping sickness disease. We can move on to the one but last, environmental effects, where if you build roads and bridges, airports, of course, it has impacts on biodiversity and CO2 emissions. And the question is, are they sufficiently taken into consideration? And then the last one, the positive one, the ripple effects. We already discussed the examples of the CDs being copied by the local radio station. And that means that there's this positive spillover effects moving way beyond your original target group. So if you want to hear more positive news, you can also vote for that one. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide where we have the code. So if you can try to scan it, everybody can do it. Even if you think I'm not very digitally savvy, I think you can make this happen. Yeah. And I see there's already some questions in the chat. Should I already respond to some questions or?
You want me to share my screen?
Yeah, let's wait for 1 second until everybody has.
Choose your adventure.
I know.
Yeah. It's true. You were there when we started 7 years ago. Huh? The first kickoff.
What's the limit?
Yeah.
How many we can vote for?
You can try.
I'm gonna do this.
Nobody has figured out yet how you can vote 3 times for the same one. So I think it's working right. Yeah, around the table here, everybody has scanned. Okay, can you pull up the results? And then I know which one I have to focus on. So yeah, we're just putting the results on the screen. Yeah. Okay. Conflict effects. Yeah, okay. And which one is the second one?
Marginalization and ripple at a time.
There's a 4-way ripple.
Oh gosh, you're making my life very complicated.
We did ranked choice voting.
Yeah, okay, so let's do conflict and marginalization, okay? If that's okay with you. So we can, and I see there's a lot of people asking questions, right? Shall I already take 1 or 2
Yeah,
questions?
we have a few, I mean, you want to answer them now, or do you want to first talk about? what the topic is?
Well, are they very urgent or not?
Well, there's people expressing support for conflict, that they want
Okay.
to dive into conflict one more. Paula, yeah.
No.
Oh. We had a comment in the chat, what about target country reliance on aid? Is that including corruption, for
Dependence.
example, or
Yeah.
siloing?
Yeah, okay.
And then migration, we had something in the chat.
Okay, so let me just get started and then people can continue asking questions and if they are urgent, you just tell me.
Sure.
Yeah. So can you go back to the PowerPoint? And so we decided that we would do conflict effects and the marginalization. So the conflict effects. So I think you understand the definition of conflict effect. Can you go about 3 or 4 slides down? Well, you're not yeah, sorry, you have to go all the, you know what, I will just
You want to go all, is it all?
there's
Oh, 4? Oh.
conflict effects. Yes. So this occurs when the external intervention strengthens rebel groups or rogue parts of the army, I would add, and or increases tension between individuals, communities, ethnic and our other groups, or between recipients and non-recipients. Let me start with the example of Mary. She's working for an international peacebuilding agency in northern Nigeria, not search, I can tell you. And she gave a testimony to us on how she was affected personally as a local staffer by the work that she was doing. She said, I see so much trauma around me that I experience secondary trauma myself. And she said, what I find very strange that I'm considered local staff, even though I am from a different part of Nigeria and it is 1,000 kilometers away. I can only travel here by plane. So I feel that I'm almost an expatriate. But what I see, the support that the expatriates get for their mental health is much more than what I get. So they can go on R&R. They have a pre-deployment training, how to deal with trauma. They have this hotline that they can call. When they come back from a mission, they have the post-deployment counseling. Why don't we get that? And I know that some agencies are trying to deliver the same quality of care for international, for local staff as for international staff, but it's not the practice that we see around most of the agencies. And she says, why don't we look at the humans providing humanitarian aid or peacebuilding aid? And I think that's a very valid point. And we often, when we think about conflict sensitivity and we think about how it affects people outside of the agency itself, but let's also look at the unintended effects for the staff of the agencies themselves. What we found, and that's on the next slide, is there's two types of conflict effects. So the direct conflict effects, in which the rebel groups can really siphon off the resources, as we have seen with the kidnappings and the ransom insurance, and then the indirect conflict effects, where you create this extra tension between various communities. And I think a lot of the effort of conflict sensitivity has been focusing a lot on this last bit. So those are the conflict effects. And so the good news is that more and more agencies are taking this seriously. Also thanks to the work of Search for Common Ground, by the way. Okay, let's move to the marginalization effects. It's about yeah, there we are. So those occur when external action contributes to an increase in inequality, either by weakening or leaving behind already vulnerable groups, or by strengthening already privileged groups. Okay, so let's give me the example on the next slide on international adoptions. And it's maybe a little bit different field, but I think it explains it very well. So we got this testimony from two Bangladeshi women who were adopted in the early 1980s. And actually, they found out that they were not adopted because their parents were not capable of taking care of them, but there was this very unclear. It was unclear to the parents that they would be away for a longer period. They thought that this would be for a permanent period. The parents thought it would be for 1 month, so they could get their act together, and then they would get their kids back. But then they were already in Europe by that time. So that's what we see often in the international child adoptions, that actually there's a real marginalization of the first families, actually, and that they are not fully aware of everything that's happening. So yeah, now there's stricter guidelines and rules and regulations, but it didn't start off like that. So what are the subtypes that we have? This is the charitable consumerism effect. I talked about the orphanages, but you see the same with this international child adoption, that it's apparently more about the donor or than about the intended target group. Well, the elite capture effects, I think you understand it, that often also the peace builders, we tend to work with local leaders or national leaders, and if you don't pay attention, they use this support really to strengthen their own position in the society or in the community. And it's something that's hard to do something about, but it's important to be aware of that. And it has to do with the language as well, that people who speak your language actually sometimes get additional access to the resources that you provide. And then the last one, I think it's important, it's the regressive targeting effects, that sometimes you tend to come up, for instance, with a new tool, can be a digital app, and but yeah, who has access to this digital app? Does everybody have access to that, or is it only people who already have a phone who know how to use it? So there can be, in the way the programs you design, there can be some kind of regressive nature if you don't pay attention to it, and creating a bigger divide. Okay, so I promised you that I won't only focus on the problems, but also focus on the solutions. So I think we should go there. And that is, yeah, we have to go down a bit. And all those examples are in the book, so you can still download it. We move to this slide. So what not to do? So I think, and we have been having quite intense discussions with USAID yesterday about this. So I'm still of the opinion that if you're not really into peace building or international development and you're still doing it, yeah, there's a higher risk that you have side effects. Because you're just doing it for another objective, to buy off some or to co-opt some allies or to stop migration. Then your side effects, if they occur, you kind of turn a blind eye to them. So I think the best remedy would actually to be really focused on achieving your objectives and work with those. What we can do, I do think, is that we should integrate more complexity thinking into our program cycle and overcome boundaries to learning. And with that, I mean the boundaries to learning, I mean that they can be individual, that you have certain deep held beliefs and you see everything in the world through that lens, and anything that doesn't correspond to that, you kind of throw away. And that prevents learning from happening. What I see happening even more in our sector is the second one, is the organizational interest. And it's difficult. Sometimes people think that they protect their organization by turning a blind eye to some of the side effects. But I think in the long run, you don't protect your organization at all by not discussing and debating them. And you can really strengthen the response of your organization by showing the dilemmas you face and how you have been dealing with them. The good news is that the technical boundaries to learning, I see that they are increasingly being overcome because of the big data, because of satellite images. You can really have a wider view of your true impact. And we can move to the next slide. Some people say, okay, after reading all those side effects, shouldn't we just stop it and call it a day? No, I do realize that there is a certain crisis in the international development sector. Funding is decreasing or being used for different purposes. So some people say, let's give up. Other people say, oh, we should have even more safeguards and stricter rules and regulations, more due diligence. So there's zero risks. I think that neither of the options are actually possible or desirable. I think that the global challenges won't go away if you just give up on peace building, for instance. But I do think that if we take risks, we should take risks, but they should relate to return. And the more return you have, if you can stop a conflict, it might be worth taking some risks. Which means that you should be a bit more nuanced and a bit more humble and encourage and defend calculated risk taking. And then the last slide. So to make that happen, I think we should move away. And some of the peace building agencies have done that already, but move away from this top-down linear thinking, which is still a bit colonialist, I would say, but really focus more on complexity thinking, evidence-based decision-making, and equal partnership. So that's the overarching conclusion that I have, and we can go into more details if people would feel that would be needed. Thank you so much.
So I'd love to open it up, but maybe just I would like to share a couple questions for you or things for you to react to. So I made reference at the outset to the different disciplines that you have direct experience with that directly correspond to the audiences that you've intended this for. So you want policymakers to pay attention, you want practitioners to pay attention, and you want evaluators and researchers to pay attention. Okay. So you've been presenting this book now in these different venues, these different audiences. I'm just curious to hear any reflection from you on, are they picking up on the same elements? Are they challenged by the same things? Or you at one point in the beginning of the book, you talked about the fact that when you call development studies preposterous, it's not to bash development studies. In fact, you're a special professor of development studies, and I think Rutledge put this out on the development studies. But what was interesting in the point that you made is that it's preposterous in terms of the breadth of the other disciplines that it claims to address, but that's also its strength because it recognizes this intersectionality, the fact that we have to be ambitious. And so it's a challenging, a lot of your critiques are like that. But then you note that, for instance, the researchers are a lot more open, it seems like, to that complexity. The practitioners tend to be much more kind of siloed in their thinking. So I'm curious if you could just reflect on the presentations you've been giving, how the book has been received from those three different sectors, what you're finding. Maybe you wish people were picking on something more, you're surprised that they're all picking up on the same things, or how they're reacting differentially. So that's the first question. And then the second one, and then we can open it up. I am struck as I'm looking through this and read through the book before you got here, so some of the things that are, there are trends that move through this space. And when you call them trends, I don't mean to diminish their importance, but the current trend on what is called localization or proximity. You talked about having a more honest conversation. I think we need a much more honest conversation on that, and what the actual impacts of this are. When I look at marginalization effects and conflict effects, some of, not even the ancillary, but even some of the primary approaches that I see to localization actually really risk supporting the elites that happen to be local, or the community locally that resonates with our values, whatever that might be, and therefore exacerbating conflict dynamics in communities, and on and on and on. So the second question I guess I have for you is, when you look at sort of trend lines, are there things that you're saying, great, that's moving towards the direction of the radical reform that I'm advocating? Are there ones that you say, you know what, that's actually quite problematic? It's actually, it's not addressing, or could even be tripping up on some of these effects. I got a lot more questions, but I want to shut up and let other people. But if you could address those two, and then let's just open it up for reactions and questions.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. And they are tough questions. Let me respond briefly, and people feel free to already start asking questions in the chat, and we'll try to go through them. So the practitioners, I have received wonderful responses from them. For instance, we did a presentation last week, and Oxfam came to me and they said, wow, since I read your book, the representative from Oxfam said, I had a discussion on program quality, and we had this issue that had been playing on the background, but we didn't have really a name for it. And now we read your book and we realized that it's this effect that we're actually talking about. And now we know how we can do something about it. So the practitioners really felt like, hey, somebody, an academic who can give us a language so that we know actually what's going on and do something about it. I was like, okay, great. So this is, I'm writing the book it's helping people. And that's the most important for me. You know, policymakers are policymakers. Until now, to be honest, I find sometimes it's more lip service. They say, oh, this is great, Dirk-Jan, this book. Wow, thank you, very insightful. But then, until now, it has been that they continue with...
You have to go back to the ministry, right?
Yeah. Well, I still have to present there as well, but I see it sometimes happening, you know, they say, great. So, because what I propose is quite radical in the sense that I say, okay, maybe we should throw away the linear planning and move to more complexity planning. Well, it's very difficult for them, you know. So let's see how that I don't know yet. And then the researchers say, yeah, we want to do this, but we want to work outside of the silos and do more long-term research, but we're not capable of doing so because of the funding requirements we have. And then I'm like, okay, that's a fair point, but why don't you try to carve some space for you to do the type of research that you do think is really relevant? So I do think that sometimes people hide a bit behind excuses and not really make this effort to really look at this broader picture. And for instance, let me give you an example of what you did, Adrian, is that in Search for Common Ground, you really paid attention to try to have more alternative methods of doing research, which don't always cost that much money. It can be outcome harvesting, outcome mapping, or and you catch a lot of more unintended effects if you use these kind of methods. So yeah, that's for the researchers. So now the trend lines, which are we going in the right direction or not the right direction? So I think what I see is that there's really this geopolitization of aid happening now. That's, this is a new era. We have to make sure that aid contributes to this new geopolitical struggle that we have with China or Russia. And I really think that's a big risk. And I do think that in the end, our geopolitical interests are really best served not by buying some votes in the UN, by giving some money to dictators, or by asking huge visibility requirements. But I think that true equitable partnerships on which you work on shared long-term challenges, be it climate change or be it migration or be it pandemic preparedness or inequality, if you really have these true international partnerships which are equitable, that is the best remedy for our geopolitical strategic interests long term. So I see it going a bit in the wrong direction because all the donors now, putting their money into geo-strategic countries instead of really these long-term partnerships. So yeah, we have to battle that, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I think it bears being said, just reacting to that really quickly is that's very explicitly happening. We see articulation of peace building funding being part of national security, advancing national security for the U.S. government or a particular government, and I can't think of a much more damaging way. You know, your last point. I mean, you actually make a point in the book.
Yeah.
I think you say if you're going to have ulterior motives, maybe just be explicit about them, because actually everyone kind of knows anyway. And let's see and try to understand what the impact of that is, which I think, again, having that more honest conversation would be really healthy. But anyway, let me stop talking. Questions, comments, reactions to Dirk-Jan? Yes. And introduce yourselves when you ask. And are you able to see? Okay.
We can alternate between.
Look, why don't we take like 3 or 4 at a time? We'll start here and then make it a couple.
Okay, so I'm Mia Bexley from Search for Common Ground, and it's less of a question and more of a comment, but when we were going through the PowerPoint, I was thinking of a documentary that I watched in my undergrad, which might have been around the time you started doing research about the harms of charitable donations from private companies. So for example, a popular shoe brand, which I won't name on the record, they had a charitable venture at one point. For every shoe sold, they would donate to a developing country, and how that kind of charitable venture creates a cycle of constant need and consumption. But when companies actually work inside the community and assist with finding people willing and able to work there, then there's more room to give back and for the local community itself to develop. And women, for example, working with the company, having more upward mobility. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. There was one of the consequences, it's slipping my mind right now, but that example fit very well into the example presented on screen.
Yeah.
Should we take a couple?
Yeah, and so we had a good question in the chat talking about tying this to the local.
The name is.
Oh, yes. So this is Lena Sackmulder, who's also a Search for Common Ground, and also one of the co-chairs of AFP's Digital Peacebuilding Community Practice. So good partnership there. But she had a question on the localization agenda. And have you found that these types of unintended consequences, are they less common? Are they less frequent with locally led organizations? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Maybe it varies across the different types of effects. And I would also she had a good question on, which kind of goes back to what you were discussing earlier. How can, donors drive incentives very powerfully, right? Have you seen any success stories in dissociating from political reasons for giving aid in the first place? Is there a way to kind of create that safe space where those political obligations and calculations maybe aren't so important and people can discuss mutual partnership more? So I would say we can go with that. I don't know if we want to do another in person, or we're giving you a lot.
Yeah, we'll come back again.
Yeah. So thanks, Lina, for the question, and sorry that I cannot see. I hope to see you soon on the screen. So the localization agenda, I think there are also unintended effects of the localization movement, but they are different than the type of unintended effects that in regular peace building is taking place, or in regular development is taking place. So, I mean, we're just starting this research, but we have been partnering with Coordinated on research on the unintended effects of localization, and there we found 2 things. So we found indeed a lot of power is now going to the larger organizations in larger local organizations at the expense of CBOs. So you kind of create a new elite type of organizations, and you create more power imbalances between the capital-based NGOs who can deal with all the complicated funding requirements and the CBOs. So there is still some inequality, but it's now located in a different level in the aid system. That is an unintended effect of this localization agenda. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but maybe you should be aware of that. Secondly, is that especially in the peace building sector, of course, why sometimes international actors are preferred is that there's some kind of there could be more neutrality because you're not a party to the conflict. Especially for peace builders, I think when you're doing the localization agenda, you have to be careful in the checks and balances that the local partners that you support are really, from 2 or 3 sides of the conflict, and that you don't inadvertently, pick a side by choosing a certain partner. So that's what we found until now, but I think it would be very important to continue researching this because there's pressure. Also yesterday when we were at USAID, they kept on stressing this 25%. We need to get to the 25% funding for local organizations. And I said, well, it's always risky if you really have this focus on a specific target, and you need to look at what's actually happening when you're trying to reach that objective. So can we dissociate from the geopolitical agenda? So, well, partially yes, partly no. So I think partly we have to try to change the narrative and show that the geopolitical agenda is best served by long-term equitable partnerships on mutual on topics of mutual interest, so not only short-term our interest, and you have to do what we think is important. So we have to change the narrative, what true geopolitical savviness means. But still, hard power is hard power, and sometimes you have to deal with it. I do think as peace building agencies, we have had a traditional difficulty in raising private funds. Because it's difficult to tell our story sometimes and to raise money for that. But I think it makes it even more important if we see that our donors are increasingly having geopolitical considerations. We have to see if we can try to diversify our funding base and continue with the good work that we are doing. Okay, so those were 2 tough questions already. I thank you for your comments. I think what you're describing, so buy one, give one, this is often what I think more about, what we would call charitable consumerism effect, that it's more about your experience as a consumer than actually about really doing something good. Yeah.
One more, you have a couple more there? Sure, yeah. If you have some non-search people on there, but let's get me on this. We'll start with you.
Okay, yeah. So non-searcher. I'm Michael Schipler. I'm Vice President of Strategy at Search. Thanks, Dirk. I want to ask you a little bit more to double down around this question around geopolitical effects on aid. Because I think for us as and I have 2 questions. One is that for us as an organization, we claim impartiality. We talk about it. It's a core vital principle, and yet our funding is coming almost entirely from a block of Western donors who are explicitly now serving political interests. How do and that's true then also of all of the local civil society who's responding and receiving funding through the localization agenda, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you push a little bit further, like how do we actually navigate that without also undermining political authority of officials, of people who are elected, a legitimate government, how that should be playing out? How should we position ourselves? The other question is about another actor you haven't mentioned, but who I think is probably one of the most significant actors we don't talk about, who are auditors, who really set and create compliance regimes, and are the most significant actor in terms of determining behaviors of aid recipients in government and outside of government. And they're specifically focused on catching the little guy, the person who rents the, car from his uncle, right? And I'm just wondering did you look at that and like the effect of that actor and the power of them and its effects on aid?
Okay.
So he cheated and asked 2 questions. We're used to that. Well, let's see. What do we got from?
Well, I'm gonna follow that and merge 2 questions just because they're a little bit similar. But So we had a questions from Ann Salinas, who's with FHI 360. And she asked, what are some of the best practices being used by organizations that are doing things right in terms of effectively avoiding these negative unintended effects? And then we had a question from Vanessa Corlazzoli, who's an independent evaluator. And she was wondering, organizations are rapidly learning. Can you maybe share an example of where one or two unintended effects led to policy changes? So we see development policy changes are not always explicitly attributed to harm that's been caused by development organizations and foreign aid. So I'm realizing now that those questions honestly really aren't that similar, but I'm going to give them to you anyway.
7 minutes to cover all.
Yeah.
And then if you get to that, what's the chief science officer really do? 'Cause
Yeah.
you could make up the most James Bond answer. No, so let's see if we can answer those
Yeah.
questions. And then I want to respect people's time because we've got
Yeah.
literally 7 minutes. So.
Yeah, no, I'll be fast. So, Anselinas, some best practices, for organizations which have been successful in dealing with side effects. I think it really has to be with an open culture in the organization, because there's what I've seen is that there's this lots of lessons are not being learned because of the organizational culture, which is a bit closed, in which if there's something going wrong, there's a tendency to not discuss this openly. And I think it's really the tone at the top, which is very important, which says, guys, peacebuilding is such a complicated field. We're really in the most difficult zones. It's okay to make mistakes and things go wrong, but try to learn from it and make sure that we share that. So I think and I see that organizations who are successful in that, creating this culture of learning actually, reduce more the side effects than those that don't. I think that Vanessa, her question was on, can you give some concrete examples where we learn from side effects? So yeah, I think what we have seen that, for instance, in the field of sexual-based violence, I think that what we saw that there was a lot of in the Eastern DRC, a lot of things went wrong because there were so many actors in the field, active in the field of sexual violence, that led even to men who didn't commit any crime were convicted for rape and ended up in jail for 10 years. So there was really a problem, and I think that donors learned, or agencies learned from that and said, okay, we should not only focus on rape, but we should have more broader gender empowerment programs and embed this with livelihood activities, not only focus on one specific sub theme altogether, because this is creating wrong incentives. It took quite a long time before this surfaced because, everybody was getting big contracts to combat sexual violence in the Eastern DRC, and it was much easier to get funding for that than for broader gender-based empowerment programs. So, I think then as an agency, you also have to be courageous and talk to your donors and saying, hey guys, you're proposing yet another program on rape, but we think that actually the problem is much broader than that. So it requires some courageous conversations from agencies to make the donors more rational. Michael, the role of auditors, I don't touch on this at all, and I should have, because I think I've been battling quite a bit with auditors when I was at Search so, to get this famous clean audit. So I think everybody is asking me what's your next book about. So maybe I should focus on the role of auditors. So thank you for this suggestion. And then I'll be very briefly on the geopolitics. And your question was. Sorry, it's too complicated. But what I see is that sometimes we hide behind neutrality. We say, we're neutral, but it's very political what we are doing. And even the humanitarians say, we are neutral. But by claiming that you're neutral, sometimes you have this tunnel vision because you are impacting the situation by your mere presence. So that's why what I said also, and Shama cited that let's be more open and more honest about that. Sometimes we are part of a broader agenda, and then you can have more honest conversations on, okay, these are the limits and how are we going to deal with that? Maybe one or two last questions.
I think we actually got everything.
Yeah.
Well, one thing is, could you maybe break down what you mean by complexity thinking when you talked about your last slide?
That's a fair point. I skipped
Yeah.
that slide and now suddenly you want to know more about it. So, Yeah, no, I think it's chapter 2 of the book. So you can just download chapter 2 from, can you maybe share the link to the book in the chat? Yeah?
It's Radboud, right?
Yeah, Routledge, and then you can just download it. So it has to do about, it's non-linear thinking. So you realize that your presence affects the system, and that there's non-linearities, feedback loops, tipping points. Well, nothing, it sounds very complex, but it's not that complex actually. What does a chief science officer do? A chief science officer makes sure that our ministry is as knowledge driven as possible. And so I try to make sure that our diplomats and our aid workers, that they read the last literature. So this is.
Can I maybe, we had one last final question that we can close on, before obviously Sean will hand it back to you, but Vanessa asked, when you were doing your research, what evidence or data did you wish you had that you couldn't find? What evidence do you need to build upon so we can better understand unintended positive effects, especially for peace building organizations and peace building community here today?
Vanessa still asks the best questions.
Right?
No, I think it would be tremendously helpful if more agencies in their evaluations actually live up to the commitments that they have, which is, the commitment is that you should not only look at intended effects, but also at unintended effects. And what we see, for instance, in the evaluations from the USAID, that only 15% of the evaluations pay attention to that. So those are the data that are missing, So if more agencies would do, really pay more attention to that, then we can learn more from all those side effects. So that's what I hope moving, that now with this top 10 in the hand, that all those evaluators know now what to look for, and that we get a richer body of literature to learn from.
Our leader of institutional learning is grinning. I mean, her smile is going, no, it's interesting because when you say that, I'm thinking of specific cases where the unintended effects were not only significant, but actually in some ways better and more educational than the intended effects. So they weren't only like not captured, but they're like, anyway, it's always great to see you, but I'm especially privileged. Thank you for everybody participating. End of the day, it's tough to stay focused, but you made it really easy given how interactive and engaging the presentation was. The book is fantastic. It really is fantastic and very easy to navigate and digest despite its depth. So thank you so much.
Okay, excellent.
Great.
Maybe you could put on the slide with where people can find it.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Like a Gen Z around me. So I have a question for you.
Yeah, go.
Very easy.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything. This is really insightful. I think we're seeing some progress with an obviously like the USAIDs of the world and other